Well, it's been a long time since I've made a video. So to get back into the swing of things, I figured I'd start the year of our Lord 2023, in the middle of the third month, with something quicker and easier as I work towards making a larger video. Both are actually about Marvel's Midnight Suns, which is actually a really cool game, and the longer video is about its central theme and how the game basically makes no sense and shouldn't really work, so tune in for that when it drops. But this video is just going to cover how much I really like how they did the combat and how expressive the game is and that kind of stuff. The game is turn-based, very similar to other games made by Firaxis. However, the novelty with this superhero-ified game is the infusion of a deck-building card game. And from the hand that you are dealt, you can play the ability cards that correspond to each hero. However, you are limited in a turn to 3 card plays, 2 redraws to hopefully replace a couple of cards with ones that are more presently useful, and a movement. This last resource is where you can reposition a hero to mess around with the angles of slammable objects, or use it to bop enemies into other enemies, environments, or your fellow heroes. These things, like the hand limit, are soft and can be temporarily increased through various means. Now, these things are designed to interact in fairly clever ways, so for instance, all of these are shared resources between your heroes. So, if one uses a move in a turn, that's it for everyone. This makes your heroes, despite having individual decks, have to function like a team. Deciding which hero uses the resource is where the tactics come in, and playing to each hero's strength, or character you could say, is better. As an example, let's give the spotlight to Spider-Man, who excels at exploiting the movement resource. His cards are geared towards gaining movement, using environmental objects, and increasing the damage he does with those environmentals. If you've watched or read any Spider-Man, playing his cards will feel like Spider-Man. Another example in regards to redraws is Iron Man, who flips that on its head, and instead of getting rid of a card for a random other card of any of the 3 heroes in play, he uses that resource to instead just make his cards better. It makes a lot of sense given his character is one that attempts to control things through technological advancement. Mechanically, you take something that is random and use it to make something you have stronger, and it also ties into his selfishness because he essentially cannibalizes a redraw, a shared resource for his own purposes. To drive that characterization even further, these cards taking up space in your hand means that you can't really get rid of them and replace them with other heroes' cards, using a redraw like you would typically do. And many of these cards are also geared toward acquiring more of his specific cards in your hand, and the more of those you have, the more powerful this card is. So, in terms of gameplay, if you have Iron Man on your team, you almost can't help but play him selfishly.
I feel at least 4% stronger than before. Gotta check on that.
A similar thing is actually done with Doctor Strange, where he will utilize the heroism, another shared resource, to make his own cards more powerful. There are also plenty of other ways that the game just nails character stuff as well. Captain America, for instance, is very much a defensive character, so his cards revolve around building up a block meter, which is just an additional health bar for himself and his allies. His deck also has a couple of cards that taunt enemies, and all of that plays really well into a character that wants to take the hit for the team, but does so without taking any damage directly, you know, as if he has some kind of shield or something. Someone like Magic, though, doesn't actually want to deal with any pain directly, whether shielded or not, and so her final ability is just to be immune to damage. But in general, she is a character that can just remove an enemy or an ally from the field, running away from the concept of taking damage in the first place. And lastly, though I could go on and on and on, Wolverine, though more aggressive, is actually similar to Captain America in his defensiveness, given his ability to just take hits. But rather than protecting himself with block, he is geared for recklessly just taking the hit, but regenerating hit points with cards and lifesteal as he jumps from enemy to enemy, you know, very much like a feral beast with regeneration. It was actually really interesting for me playing the game for the first time as a big fan of Wolverine, because in his first mission he is taking on Sabretooth, you know, as he tends to do, and the Hunter shows up to try and help. Because of a flop of tactics, I got the Hunter killed fairly early on. In fairness to myself though, they appear to be invisible, but that's just a bug carried over from the end of the last battle. But anyway, it was just Wolverine solo for the rest of the mission is the point. And though that might seem like it would have made things harder, it became very clear after a while that Wolverine is the best there is at what he does.
I've got a reputation to protect.
And turn after turn, I would just draw his cards, get hit by Sabretooth, regen it all back with Wolverine's cards, and rinse and repeat until eventually Sabretooth was defeated. I just remember this feeling of having like an overwhelming sense of, yes, this is perfect. This is the Wolverine Sabretooth story playing out in mechanical form, expressed by a deck builder. And it goes to show how perfectly the system was designed, but also how the decks and these extraneous mechanics like lifesteal, chain attack, block, and frenzy go to expressing these characters mechanically. Oh, and speaking of frenzy, this is also brilliant, and I love it even though it is such a pain to deal with. Frenzy is a mechanic that can be applied to enemies. Sabretooth, characteristically, is one such enemy, and it allows them to take an action, usually just, smashing you in the face, based on a certain number of card plays, rather than just on their designated turn. Acting outside of the turn paradigm is just the greatest. It's super annoying to deal with since you can now get a hero hit, stunned, or even killed during your own turn, and that makes a frenzied enemy truly scary. But also, mechanically, it feels much more like they are acting outside of the rules, outside of reason, which, is just perfect. I also like it purely from a tactics point of view, because much of the game is just trying to exploit or gain free cards, or have card plays refunded, because it just allows you to do more in a turn. And having a frenzied enemy, especially a boss, forces you to think much more about individual card plays, which gives you the feeling of being pressed during the safety of your turn. Another thing that I happened to notice and ended up appreciating during the Sabretooth fight are these little one-shot minions who run in. What's really great about these guys is that though one-shot guys are kinda dumb and typically fade out of existence in these tactics games, especially towards the end game, they are absolutely essential to the flow of gameplay throughout Midnight Suns. Typically, superhero movies are criticized because they tend to all, especially the team-up ones, end up in a third act climax that is just a series of shots of dealing with a bunch of popcorn enemies. We know that the fight is basically about a bigger threat, but you have to showcase teamwork, and so these popcorn enemies are thrown at the heroes to give them something to do. In Midnight Suns, every single minion is really important. The reason this is achieved is through things like the quick mechanic. This little card trait means that if you kill an enemy with the use of the card, it refunds the card play, which means that you can play an additional card that turn. Now, that's good on its own, but many cards with quick are paired with other things like knockback, and other cards give you strengthened or card draws when you KO an enemy. This means that you can use these minions to soften up the harder enemies using knockback, or use them to power up the hero team. This makes them consistently useful through all parts of the game, which I think is rather cool, when in a general media sense, it seems like they're often just there for aesthetics only. And on higher difficulties, in Midnight Suns, exploiting them is absolutely necessary. Oh, and speaking of difficulty, I also really like how Midnight Suns handles difficulty. Rather than just have an option at the start for, story, an easy mode, medium, hard, etc., which you have literally no frame of reference for, you just play the game, and as you go and naturally gain a better understanding of the mechanics, you will begin to unlock a slow progression of higher difficulties, which you can switch to or back out of at any time. I also like how it tells you what the change in difficulty actually means, like having fewer resurrections, in exchange for gaining more gloss, etc. And much of that will only make sense once you start playing. This gets rid of the guesswork of the previous system, and the slow unlock works better narratively since it follows the story's progression of increasing stakes. One final thing I'll say about Midnight Suns that didn't quite fit in with the rest of the main video that will be coming out is that I actually find it really interesting that they chose Midnight Suns as the property to use for a game that has XCOM at its base. Because if there was any property that Marvel has that maps perfectly onto XCOM, it's the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I'm just going to take this opportunity to talk about the fact that I really like the TV show, which involves a ragtag group of highly competent agents that have to fight a larger power structure with limited manpower and resources. Like, it's almost one-to-one how much things map on. You've got the commander person that leads the organization, you've got an elite soldier, you've got both sides of the tech development in terms of mechanical engineering and biology, and they go on missions to save the world. The structure of the show, initially as a Monster of the Week thing, but then expanding onto larger season-long, you could call them, campaigns, I think lends itself really well to what XCOM is. And though I really like Midnight Suns and what it does with the superhero stuff and expressing it in gameplay, part of me is like, could this not have just been an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. game based off of the TV show instead? Pretty please with a cherry on top? Like, seriously, I would do a lot of unscrupulous things to make this thing reality. Like, I can already imagine what the logo would look like, and if it were me, you would just have a S.H.I.E.L.D. logo, but just made up a bunch of faceless agent archetypes, which is, really thematic, but would also, in addition to that, pay homage to XCOM 2's logo of this alien head being made up of human skulls. Anyway, look, I could go on for days about how well you could translate the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show to an XCOM style game, but anyway, this video is meant to be a quick and easy sort of deal to get me into the swing of things. If you've made it this far, thank you very much, and I hope that you'll be around again for the next one.